It is now less than 2 years to this magic date of the 21st of December 2012. And I think it's a good idea if we find out what this is actually all about. There is a lot of nonsense, as one would expect, especially since Hollywood got hold of it. But there is a rather large portion of truth in what has been said. Now, I've been asked many, many times, will these earthquakes and volcanoes appearing and tidal waves in New York and so on? Not very likely. I mean, have you noticed anything like that yourself recently? There has been a little bit, and this is what we'd expect, because 2012, 21st of December, we're not talking about an event which happens on that day. So you go to sleep on the 20th of December and everything is normal, and you wake up on the 21st and the world is on fire. No, not going to happen. What is happening is two things that we can sort of prove scientifically, and one thing which apparently is a load of nonsense. So let's deal with the nonsense first. There is a story circulating, I don't know its origin, but which says that on the 21st of December 2012, all the planets of the solar system will lie in a straight line, and the gravitational pull upon the Earth will cause enormous earthquakes and volcanoes, etc., etc. Astrologically speaking, this is absolute nonsense. The closest thing to a straight line for the planets is apparently supposed to happen in September in the year 2040. I hope to be around to witness it. Might be one of my last experiences in this incarnation. But that's all there is to it. And even then, it's not a perfect line. There's a 9-degree discrepancy. So it could have interesting effects, but it doesn't concern us right now. Certainly nothing like that is happening at the end of 2012. What is happening are two things. One is the precession of the equinoxes. Now, you might know what that means, you might not. And this has to do with astrology, which is also backed up by astronomy, because, well, astronomy is an extract of astrology. And what this basically means is that the dominant constellation at dawn will move from Fisher or Pisces into Aquarius. Now, this isn't a single event. The precession of the equinox takes place over a period of just over 70 years. So it's not a single event. Maybe some astrologers would say that the midpoint of the change is the 21st of December 2012. Well, maybe not. It's not that important. The point being is that it's a cycle which is approximately 2,000 years long. And as I say, we're just in the process of moving from Pisces into Aquarius. So the constellation Aquarius will become the sole dominant constellation at dawn. That's all that this means. Astrologically speaking, there is some considerable significance here, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, the other thing which is happening is the precession of our planet through the galactic equator. Now, I better explain what this means. You may or may not know that our galaxy, the Milky Way, is a spiral galaxy. Here's a photograph of one. It isn't our galaxy, of course, because it's taken from several hundred light years away, but it looks fairly similar to ours. This is what a spiral galaxy looks like. This is a different galaxy, photographed from the edge, so that you could see approximately what our type of galaxy looks like, which is a spiral galaxy. That it has an enormous disk shape, and it's not very thick. When I say it's not very thick, the thickness is about 80 light years, and the diameter is several hundred light years. And our sun, on the planets which go around it, are on one of the arms, about a third of the way along from the centre of the galaxy, which spirals around the middle of the galaxy. However, our orbit is not a straight line. It's a sine wave, a wobble. So sometimes our solar system is above the plane, the equator of the galaxy, and sometimes it's below. Only every 25,000 years, approximately, our solar system passes through the galactic equator. What does this mean? Well, it means that approximately every 25,000 years, we have an enormous increase in the gravitational effects from the galaxy itself happening upon our planet. We have considerable changes to the magnetic grid, which determines how much energy reaches this planet. And this is the actual cause of the weather changes. It's got nothing to do with carbon dioxide. That's just a scam, which I'll go into in a few more minutes. And this is where we are right now. Now, the event passing through the galactic equator is not something that happens in one day. You have to take in mind the enormous size, the enormous distances that we're talking about. And to actually pass through the galactic equator takes about 36 years, and it actually started in 1980 and is calculated to be complete by the year 2016. So we're more than halfway through it. The midpoint was calculated to be around the cusp of the years 1998 to 1999. Now, you will notice that the heavy weather changes and volcanic activity and such like increases from 1980 onwards. Up until then, things were pretty stable, as they have been for the last few hundred years. But as from then on, because the tide from the galaxy itself increases, we get movements in the Earth's crust, we get unusual movements in the seas, and we get these so-called natural catastrophes happening with increased frequency. That's all that is going on. We're just passing through the plane of the galactic equator. This increases gravity, this increases the magnetic field effect from the galaxy itself, which in turn has an effect upon the magnetic grid of the Earth, causing weather changes, and also causes movement, unusual movement, in the Earth's crust, which is very, very friable, very, very unstable. It doesn't take much to move it. And you just imagine the weight of a galaxy. It's an unimaginable thing, it really is. It's so huge that I don't think you could get the number within the frame of this film, even if you wrote on several lines. So although it's a long way away, the effect is there because it's so massive. This is also said that there is an additional cycle happening, one that happens approximately every 5,000 years. Some say specifically 5,250, some say 5,125. Again, it's an enormous astrological event, astronomical event, I should say, but also astrological. Something that happens around that time. And if we dig into the cause of the Antarctic ice, something which has remained stable for several million years, we actually find these things happening every 5,000 years. There's an enormous change in conditions on Earth. So we've had periods of fire, where the Earth appears to be on fire. We've had periods of flood. We've had periods of freezing. And according to the legends, what's happening now is the point of ether, or consciousness. That is, we have a choice to make. And the choice is between insanity and destruction and awakening and God consciousness. That's where we're going now. So just before I complete this first section, I must mention the Mayan calendar on which the whole of this story rests. The question is, why does the Mayan calendar end on the 21st of December 2012? Well, let me put the question this way around. The calendar that you buy from Woolworths, or could have bought last year from Woolworths, ends on the 31st of December 2010. Why? Well, because they want to sell you another calendar next year, or traditionally, that's the end of the year and you need a new calendar with different pictures in for the next year. There is no greater significance to it than that. It's just that this stone which they found actually goes up until the 21st of December 2012. It's got to end somewhere. I mean, you know, the stone can't recarve itself as the dates progress. That's all there is to it. It just ends that there because, well, that was the end of their year. End of story. And also the Mayan calendar that a lot of these prophecies are coming from is not a Mayan calendar, it's an Aztec calendar, and the bit in the middle is the bit that they've taken from the Mayans. So breathe deeply. The world is most unlikely to end as long as we do something significant, which I will explain in the next part. So, relax. It's all going according to plan, if I may say so. A little over 300 years ago, Sir Isaac Newton caused the separation between astrology and astronomy, with his definition of the universe as a mechanical object, where things progress mechanically from one state to the next, and there's nothing more than that there. And his statement that consciousness is just a figment of your imagination. That's an intellectual joke, by the way, folks. Now, there is actually a lot in astrology, and I'm not personally an astrologer. I just made a study of it, about 35 years ago now, because I was curious about one thing. If astrology is so useless as many claim, why has it survived and thrived? I mean, you wouldn't have any difficulty finding an astrologer close to where you live, no matter where you are. So it thrives for more than 5,000 years. If, on the other hand, it is so omnipotent, as others claim, why is not the whole of our society regulated by the expressions of astrologers? And here I want to give a quote from one of the world's richest men. And he said, "Millionaires do not consult astrologers. Billionaires do." Interesting, what? Anyway, I got interested in this question. Where is the middle ground? Why has it survived? And what is its actual area of effectiveness? Now, in terms of using it for character analysis, it is absolutely amazing what you can see in an astrology chart and the interpretation of it. In areas of predicting specific events, it's almost useless. I mean, you can define a trend and say something in this area will change, but there's no way you can say what it will be. And this is what has caused this dichotomy. Anyway, the experiment which I did, well, first of all, I got myself a book from the library about basic astrology and looked at it. Looks interesting. And then I sent my birth details off to a number of these, at the time, postal astrological consultations and compared them. And the fascinating thing is, they were all almost identical, and they were all a very accurate description, I mean not 100%, but a very accurate description of the way my life had been until then. And of course they made projections from there, but I can't say that I actually retained them, so I'm not quite sure what was on there now. But for me, the important thing was to see, yeah, the character analysis which they've made is very, very accurate. Now, you can do this yourself at any time. I mean, you can do it online now. Just send your birth details off. You can even get friends to send an application in their name, but using your birth time and place. And just compare. You see there's an amazing accuracy. There's an amazing coherency. So there is a lot to astrology, but it does need clarifying, along with lots of other things. Now, what's actually happening to the planet right now? There is a wave of insanity leaving the planet. Now, this is the way we've lived for the last few thousand years, in an area of insanity, centered primarily around the belief, and it is a taught belief, it's not a real belief, it's a taught belief that lack can exist. And we've been inculcated in this belief, and from there on we've been taught in order to have what we need, we must kill other people. Now, I find that pretty insane in itself, but especially when, if you look at the table of natural resources of this planet, there's more than enough here of everything for all 6.9 billion of us to have the lifestyle of a millionaire. Now, present society is where we have a tiny, tiny number who have far more than they could ever possibly use, and vast numbers living on the edge of starvation. And some go over the edge, quite a few go over the edge every day and die of starvation. In a world of plenty, it's just that it's not evenly distributed. We've been taught to give what is ours to a tiny minority who actually want to own the whole planet, including owning humanity. That is totally insane. Some say that there is a plan by these a tiny minority to kill off the majority of the human population. Well, they're working on it. So we need to know what insanity looks like. Well, here's a statue of the devil from the church in Rennes-la-Chaux in France. Does it bear a similarity to anyone that you know? Dick Cheney, Al Gore, maybe one or two others. This is the face of insanity. Now, the ages which the world has experienced to date and how they've come to an end have up till now been matters of physical changes in the Earth's structure. That is, we as conscious individuals have had very little to say in the matter. Here it's different. Here it's about ether, it's about choice, it's about consciousness. Here is the time when we have the choice to make. We have the decision to make, and we cannot avoid it. To try to avoid the decision is the decision for self-destruction. You know, there is no middle ground. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. And the choice is between continuing to let ourselves be chattel or taking command of our own lives. And in the next section, what I'm going to try and show to you is what we have to make choices about. And this relates to, amongst other things, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which are actually visible right now. So what is the first horseman? Well, in the book of Revelations, this is the conqueror, the one who takes everything. And here we see this quite clearly with the banking cartel. Now, on paper, the banking cartel actually owns as much as 75% of everything on the planet. Now, I'm not talking about third world countries and things like that. I'm talking about your home, your car, your job, your employer, your country belongs to the banking cartel. Now, how have they done this? Well, they've done it because this is the only legalized fraud on the planet. And what a bank does is to lend money that doesn't exist, which you then have to repay with real money. You see, that's how they get hold of everything in their hands. Now, you go to a bank and borrow money. What do? Do they give you money? Well, but a small thing, you know, $50 or whatever, they might give you cash out of the till. Might. But mostly they don't. What they do, what they actually say is to you, well, we would like to lend you some money, and if we had it, we would do it, but we haven't actually got any, but we will give you this promise that if we ever had this money, we would lend it to you. And you just sign this contract in exchange for this promise to lend you money, which we might have at some future date. You will pay to us, well, you know, what it cost for a house. You pay to the bank 3 times as much as it cost to build the house. What have they done? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, other than to write a debt onto your bank account. That's all they've done. Nothing more than that. Now, you take this promise from the bank and you take it to the builder or the person you're buying the house from, and they take this promise and give this promise to their bank, and their bank says, oh, we now have more assets. We can lend even more money. Now, a bank is actually allowed by law to lend 10 times as much as it actually has. However, because of this neat little addendum, a bank receiving a promise from another bank counts the promise as an asset, which it isn't. It's just hot air, means nothing. And then this bank does the same thing, and you have a chain of banks lending promises to each other, and which they then count as assets. So for every 1,000 euros, pounds, or dollars which actually exists, the bank is owed, on paper, approximately $1 million, pounds, euros. Now do you see where inflation comes from? the banking system inflates the economy. It's the only thing it can do for the economy not to collapse, for the banks not to collapse. The amount of debt has to increase day by day by day. And because we're talking about debt, we're not talking about real worth, we're talking about empty promises. The value of the promises falls day by day by day, which means that using the real money that exists, which is a small proportion of the money in circulation, you have to pay day by day more and more to get the basic things which you need. A deliberate policy. This is the policy of the conqueror. Take everything. Everything is mine. That's one level of insanity. Do we permit that to continue? Or do we do something else? One of the scams of the banking cartel is the global warming. Now, if we look at hard scientific fact, we see that it is not happening. Let me just give you some examples of global warming, such as this lighthouse in the state of Ohio.
It looks like a bizarre alien world, but this eerie landscape is actually Lake Erie. It's so cold in Ohio that a lighthouse has become an ice house. Frozen spray has blown off the Great Lake, creating a giant ice sculpture. Unusually cold weather has pounded the eastern half of the United States, with temperatures being pushed well below normal from the Great Lakes to Florida. Snow's pelted northern Ohio, western Pennsylvania and New York, and the big chill's expected to last another week.
We will look at temperatures. Summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere have been rising over the last few years. Winter temperatures have been falling. And what we actually have is not an increase in global temperature, but an increase in the variation between summer and winter temperatures. So, for example, in 2001 in Hessen in Germany, it was an unusually cold winter, and the temperature actually went down to -10 centigrade, that is 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The variation between that and the high summer temperature was 42 degrees centigrade, which is 107 degrees Fahrenheit. In 2010, the coldest day was -22 centigrade, so that's -9 Fahrenheit, and the variation from hottest day to coldest day was not 42 degrees, but 60 degrees. That is, instead of 107 degrees, it's gone up to 140 degrees variation between hottest and coldest day. You cannot get that by the action of a gas which is diffused in the entire atmosphere. You can get it by variations in the magnetic flux, which we spoke about, or I spoke about earlier on, as an aspect or a result of our solar system passing through the plane of the galactic equator. It's a physical phenomenon. However, Princeton University has shown with a number of very interesting experiments that the Earth's magnetic grid can be moved, can be changed, can be altered by human consciousness. They've been taking measurements for years and years and years and noticed that events which attract the attention of large numbers of people actually show up in the magnetic grid. So the death of Princess Diana, enormous focus of humanity on it, which shows up in the magnetic grid. Or when those, whatever things they were, went into the World Trade Center, and the, well, whoever it was, then demolished the buildings, the world attention on that was enormous, and it shows itself in the magnetic grid. Now, we can change the magnetic grid by massed attention upon it. And this is something we'll be doing a little bit later in the year 2011, but not very much later. It's a separate video which I'll be recording shortly. Then we have the stories of the Arctic ice is melting. Well, yes and no. Yes, it's melting in the north, and no, it's not melting in the south. And the reason why it's melting in the north has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. It has a lot to do with a 1,000-mile long chain of undersea volcanoes which are actually passing under the North Pole. That is warming the water under the ice and melting the ice. Which is why this video that someone sent me a few months ago of people in Lapland complaining that the ice doesn't form properly, and this is causing problems for the reindeer with the footing. It's got nothing to do with carbon dioxide, but has everything to do with the fact that one of the ends of this chain of volcanoes is quite close to Lapland. And that is what's warming the ice, not carbon dioxide. So the question we now have to look at, what was actually signed at Cancun? It can't possibly have been an agreement to end global warming by reducing carbon dioxide. I mean, the majority scientific opinion now is that is total nonsense. And even the International Panel on Climate Control, almost all of the few remaining scientists clinging to it have been totally discredited by scientific fact. Global warming isn't happening. Large variations in temperature are happening. And they are happening because of movement changes in the magnetic grid. They're not happening because of a very, very tiny proportion of one of the lesser constituents of the atmosphere. But what was signed at Cancun was an agreement to transfer sovereignty from the participating nations to the United Nations. That is, what happened at Cancun is your country as a sovereign country no longer exists. What was signed at Cancun was an agreement to establish an enormous bureaucracy controlled by nobody knows who, officially. Practically we do know, we're talking about Rockefeller and friends of that ilk, Rothschild, Halliburton. They're the people who are going to be dictating your life through this enormous bureaucracy. And the United Nations now has the power to tax you directly in order to pay for the establishment of this bureaucracy. The question is, are we going to let them do it? Or are we going to do something else? This again will be a separate video outlining solutions, outlining ways of getting out of this during the course of 2011. So then we come to the second horse, famine, exemplified by Monsanto. Facts about Monsanto, about genetically modified organisms in general. Monsanto themselves have admitted, albeit to date in the financial press, that they are in financial difficulties. because up to 20% of their seeds do not germinate. Further than this, of the plants which do grow, a growing proportion do not produce any fruit, do not produce any crop. They're sort of, I don't know, what's the word? Eunuchs. Nothing happens. There's no fruit, no product, nothing to eat. And yet, North America, the US of A, has just a few days ago passed a law making, for all practical purposes, making any other form of agriculture illegal and putting Monsanto in charge of food safety. Do we need anything more insane than this? Well, yes, we can add this in. We can say, genetically modified organisms are good for you. Well, are they? You see, the problem is, this is the real problem with GMOs that is not talked about. But this is the kern problem, the core problem. The genetic structure has been changed. The digestive enzymes that you produce have evolved over very long times to digest specific organic structures. Now, no matter what it might look like to the naked eye, if that genetic structure cannot be digested by the enzymes that you produce, then you starve to death. And there's actually a prophecy made by the Council of Shamans as the European invaders began to persecute and drive the Indians from their lands. And they said, don't fight the Europeans. Soon they will have full plates and nothing to eat. They will cease to be, and then we can take back our ancient lands. And that's exactly what the US of A has embarked upon over the past few days, having full plates and nothing to eat because it is not digestible. The second horseman, genetically modified organisms personified by Monsanto. The third horseman, fear, we can see in the pharmaceutical cartel conglomerate. This has been their business for a very long time. It actually had its origins in an attempt by the papacy, actually Pope Innocent VIII, if I remember correctly, in the year 1484, decided to use the Inquisition, which was created to squash the neo-Christian sects who are teaching a much more human-friendly form of Christianity and, of course, damaging papal power. And the Pope decided, well, we've got rid of our opposition within the church. What can we now do with this organization, the Inquisition? And it was decided to resolve the biggest problem which they had, the final solution. And this biggest problem was the wise or Wicca women. And Wicca actually means wise. It doesn't mean evil, it means wise. So wicked actually means highly educated, a teacher. That's what the word actually means. And the wise or the Wicca women were the ones to whom the populace in general turned to for help and advice, because these were the women who were trained in herbal medicine, in natural balance, in the wisdom of the seasons, etc., etc. They knew what they were doing, which is why the people went to them and not to the mostly ill-educated Catholic priests. And what was decided was that from the pulpit, it would be preached throughout Christendom that the wise women, the Wicca women, were evil, working in league with the devil. Devil is actually a relatively new invention of the church, only a couple of hundred years earlier. An anti-god. And as an alternative to the wise women, the doctors of medicine were declared from the pulpit to be the divinely approved healers. And that's where it all started from this political con game, this excuse to murder tens of thousands of highly educated women because of their knowledge, to prevent knowledge reaching the people. Knowledge will make you free. And they wanted you as a slave. So they taught through fear of damnation that you mustn't go to the wise women who know what they're doing. You must go to the doctors of medicine. And that's the beginning of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, it didn't really gain momentum until the end of the 19th century with those con artists, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, who, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, decided to declare germs as being the cause of all illness, as they patently cause no illness. And it was known at the time, it was proved to both of them at the time, that such a thing is impossible. This was grasped by a certain segment of the medical fraternity and propounded as being the knowledge. Pharmaceuticals came a little later in the scene in the sense of becoming an enormous power. And it happened because of Rockefeller, who, the owner or founder of Standard Oil, ostensibly the richest man in the world, decided to invest heavily into the pharmaceutical companies, thinking that he could sell his oil as a medicine. Well, it's not that much of a fantasy. It has actually happened more than once that crude oil has been sold as medicine. Now, in the 1920s, the pharmaceuticals did become a major power, especially in Germany. And it was they who began in the late 1920s with the experiments, medical experiments on outcasts from society. It wasn't something that Hitler invented, it's something that continued from long before his time. Also, the pharmaceutical conglomerate in the form from IG Farben industry was Hitler's major financier. And not only this, it was they who gave Hitler his instructions which countries to invade so that IG Farben industry could confiscate their competitors in that country. This is a real story of pharmaceuticals. Now, at the end of World War II, as most people know, IG Farben industry was broken up on paper. They very quickly put themselves back together, just didn't officially merge into one company, but act as one company for all intents and purposes. And in the early 1960s, under the leadership of the self-same people who were in charge of hydrocarbon industry throughout the Second World War, they hatched another program and promoted another protege. This time it wasn't Hitler, it was Helmut Kohl, who for 13 years looked after the interests of the pharmaceutical conglomerate within the German government. This is why Germany has such interesting laws relating to medicines, but we'll go into that maybe at some other point, or maybe not. However, the existence of pharmaceutical medicine relies absolutely on an enormous propaganda machine, which has a budget of several hundreds of millions of dollars, euros, pounds every year. The basis of modern medicine is not science, it's propaganda. Pharmaceutical medicine has no scientific base, none whatsoever. If I can just quote Professor Lipton on this, pharmaceutical medicine is in no way scientific. It represents merely and exclusively the marketing strategy of the pharmaceutical manufacturers. You are taught to believe that if you use anything other than pharmaceuticals, you will die in agony. That is what you're asked to believe. Because of this fear that you've been taught, most people don't look at alternative ways of achieving what they're looking for, that is, their health, their vitality, their balance. They don't look at the natural ways. They're taught that unless you use pharmaceuticals, you will die in agony. So it's the fear which they promote day by day by day that leads people to use pharmaceutical medicine instead of techniques which actually work. Now, we see this extending in the area of law, where in the last few years the pharmaceutical conglomerate have purchased legislation making other techniques, non-pharmaceutical techniques, illegal because they work. Not because they don't work, but because they do work, as opposed to pharmaceutical medicine, which actually does not work. It's just a big propaganda myth. So now in Europe we have an EEC regulation which is due to come into force in April 2011, which for all practical purposes makes it a crime to use natural herbs and their extracts to heal illnesses, which is what they're on the earth for. That's why they are there, to help and succor us. And again, fear of punishment. You're being taught, you've been educated into not using that which functions. Another aspect of the pharmaceutical cartel activities is Codex Alimentarius. The intent here is to, amongst other things, make nutritious food illegal. In fact, in the USA, they've just passed a law doing precisely that. It makes the growing, even the possession of seeds of natural, nutritious plants, it makes that a crime. And guess who's just been put in charge of food safety in North America? Monsanto. Do you need to know anything more? The last of the four horsemen, death, is the energy cartel. This basically started with oil, but has expanded into everything to do with energy that we need, whether it be oil or gas or electricity. Most of it is controlled by one small group of people. Now, in 1935, the first water-powered car was invented. Approximately every 3 years since then, someone else has reinvented it or invented another way of doing the same thing. That is, for more than 70 years, mankind has known how to build an automobile which runs on water. Don't need any oil, well, for lubrication, but certainly not to burn. Don't need it. And what happens to the people who invent them? Well, most of them suddenly die. What a coincidence. About every 7 years, someone invents or discovers a source of free electricity, literally pulling electricity out of the free air. In quantum physics, it's quite easily understandable how this could be done, but the precise mechanics of doing it need a good engineer. But I say, approximately every 7 years, someone reinvents or invents a new way of doing it, and most of these people mysteriously die. There have been devices invented which are so energy efficient, they actually consume about 1% of the electricity which the devices which we're accustomed to actually consume. As you may or may well not know, most of the electricity which we purchase gets thrown away in heat and electrosmog. It's rare that more than 3% of the electricity which is generated would actually be used. So you see, 97% of what you're paying for is dead. Well, not only dead, it's causing death in the environment as well. It's causing major problems for the navigation systems of bees and some birds, which again is causing problems with pollination of plants, which is causing problems with growth of food plants. It's quite a vicious circle. That's the Four Horsemen. Again, in a later video, we'll show ways of leaving this prison and doing something else. Now, we also need to look at the links, because these Four Horsemen don't act independently of each other. Oh no. Look at this. Oil. The beginning of the 20th century, Standard Oil, the Rockefeller family. Going back further, we have the Rothschild or Rothschild family into banking. So Rockefeller invested in pharmaceuticals, invested in banking, which is where he linked up with Rothschild. They financed genetically modernized organisms. They created the United Nations, and the United Nations was actually created by the Four Horsemen. At the end of the Second World War, the Nazi Party, or the visible Nazi Party, was removed from power, but the Nazi Party was just the political wing of a secret society based at that time in southern Germany. At the end of the war, they moved from Germany to New York, where, together with people like Fritz Termeer, the man at IG Farben Industry who had Auschwitz built and managed, and it was managed by the pharmaceutical industry, not by the Hitler's SS, but the pharmaceutical industry built and managed Auschwitz. They went over to New York and established the United Nations, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and a few other things, modelled upon Nazi Germany. Now we have, in addition to this, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is an exact model of the Gestapo, with exactly the same objectives. If the real objectives were what the objectives said would be, Federal Emergency Management Agency would be equipped with earth-moving machine, helicopters, rescue, ambulances. No, they're equipped with heavy weapons, submarines, tanks. What do they need those for if their objective is to rescue people? Federal Emergency Management Agency manages the national spy system to spy upon the American people. What has that got to do with rescuing? It's all a lie. It's all the Four Horsemen gathering for the final confrontation. The question is, what are we going to do? Because we, you see, have the overwhelming power to succeed. Are we going to focus it and win? Or are we going to lay down and let the Four Horsemen trample over us? This is something which each of us has to decide. And that includes you. I know what my decision is. I made it long ago. What are you going to do? Now, here's something that could be helpful. It's a mantrum. Now, this is a mantra is a word which has been much maligned over the last half century, and it's also begun to be used online as though the repetition of any word or any sentence is a mantram. No, it isn't. And mantram is the single form of the word. Mantra is the plural form, just to make that clear. Now, mantra is a precise science. It's actually based upon the observable fact that particular sounds, particular pieces of music will have direct effects upon your body, upon your feelings, upon your thoughts, upon your environment, something that everybody's experienced. But here in the West, it's been very, very little researched. In the East, and especially in the ancient Vedic and Rusved cultures, this phenomenon has been very, very deeply researched. And that's where most of the mantra come from. Now, the mantra are written as little sentences, or in some cases short songs, as an, what's the word? A way, a mnemonic, a way of helping you to remember the correct tones and the correct sequence. And there are thousands of mantras, each having its own particular purpose. On this particular one, it's rather long, but the text is available on the fact sheet, which you get the address at the end of this video. And this is the I can do anything mantra. And what this does, by repeatedly singing this mantra, you will awaken and strengthen within yourself the knowledge that you are capable of doing anything, anything at all. Om Sarva Mangala Mangalye Shive Sarvat Sarike Sharanye Triambake Gori Naryani Namastute Shristi Stiti Vinasharang Shakti Bhute Sanatani Gunashvaraye Gunamaye Naryani Namastute Sharanagata Dinartha Pariprana Paranye Sarvasati Hare Devi Naryani Namastute Kali Kali Mahakali Kali Ke Paparini Dharma Karma Prade Devi Naryani Namastute Kali Kali Maka Kali Kali Ke Paparini Sarvigna Hare Devi Naryani Namastute Janti Mangala Kali Badra Kali Kapalini Durga Kashama Shiva the three Swaha Swadam Namastute Jaya Twang Devi Chamandei Jaya Bhutatri Harini Jaya Sarva Chate Devi Kalaratri Namastute. Namaste. Until next year.